Hello, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you so much to all the researchers joining us today. My name is Lou Peck, and I'm working with the Wiley author team, and I'll be chairing this webinar. Now, in the course of the next hour, we're going to be presenting a webinar called Preparing a Publication on a Veterinary Topic. And you'll hear expert guidance from Aiden and hints and tips to help you to get published. Now, this webinar is brought to you in collaboration with the American College of Veterinary Dermatology, with the European Society of Veterinary Dermatology, and Wiley. Now, before we start, there are a couple of housekeeping items I'd just like to mention. We have a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please do take the time to add any questions that you have in the questions area, and we'll answer those at the end of the webinar. You will also notice that we'll have a couple of pop-up polls that will appear. If you could take the time to just answer those, that would be fantastic, because we'd love to hear your feedback. A recorded version of this webinar will be available once we've finished on wileyauthors.com/webinars. There's also a link to that under the Resources tab on the right-hand side. Please feel free to share this link with your colleagues and your networks. And also in that resources area, you will see that there are some other links for you. Now, joining us today, we have Aiden Foster. And he is a senior teaching fellow in veterinary dermatology and pathology at Bristol Veterinary School, the University of Bristol, based at the Langford campus in England. He studied biology and veterinary science at the universities of Nottingham and Bristol, which are both in England as well. He trained as a veterinary dermatologist at Bristol and the University of Wisconsin in the US. He worked for Animal and Plant Health Agency, which you may also know as APHA, in a number of roles dealing with the investigation of diseases of farmed livestock and wildlife. He developed particular interests in camelids and deer, as well as dealing with cattle, goats, pigs, poultry, sheep, and wildlife. He has a particular interest in publishing and is Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the journal Veterinary Dermatology and a board member for In Practice. He is co-editor of the textbook entitled Veterinary Allergy. Now, Aiden consults on dermatology cases and supports the Farm Animal Pathology Service at Langford, which provides a post-mortem service for farm livestock. He is involved in the training and clinical residents with a particular focus on veterinary dermatology. As well, he teaches students on the veterinary nursing and bioveterinary science and the veterinary science degree programs. He's an honorary member of the European Society of Veterinary Dermatology and a past president, having served the board for 10 years. He is also a member of the American College of Veterinary Dermatology. I am delighted now to hand you over to Aiden, who's going to talk to you about preparing a publication on a veterinary topic.
Thank you, Lou, for that introduction. It's very kind of you. And I'd like to thank Wiley for helping us to make this webinar today. We appreciate your technical expertise and support. The origin of this presentation is that ESVD were keen for their members to have access to this presentation, given that over the years we've given something similar to the European College of Veterinary Dermatology residents and to the American College of Veterinary Dermatology residents. And I teach at Bristol Vet School and teach the residents there about preparing a publication. So this is a topic that hopefully is of interest to you today, particularly if you're relatively new to publishing. And at the outset, I must say that although I've been editing and reviewing and writing articles for many, many years, I still feel this is a process that we learn and hone and improve as time goes by. So it can be quite a daunting process when you're first getting going with this, but I hope that in the next hour or so that I can share with you a few take-home messages that you'll find of value if you're involved in publishing. At the outset, I'd also like to make some special thanks to my colleagues Karen Moriello and Hal Williams. Karen is one of the editors on the journal Veterinary Dermatology and has been there for many, many years, and I particularly appreciate her expertise and skill and knowledge. And I think it's an example of how editors actually don't work in isolation. They work generally as teams now to make decisions and to hopefully improve the publishing process for the authors that we deal with. Hal Williams is, for me, a very special person who I met a number of years ago. Hal is a dermatologist who works in the human field at the University of Nottingham, and his name will crop up a few times during this presentation. Hal has shared some of his expertise as a dermatologist with veterinarians, with veterinary dermatologists, and he's been chair of the Cochrane Library for Dermatology and is a well-recognised international expert on systematic reviews. So their input both has helped to shape this presentation, and some of the images that you're going to see and some of the text is from Karen. When we think about publishing, for scientists and authors, we need to acknowledge that we're actually entering a very, very large area of commercial enterprise, and it's something of an anomaly that authors submit papers and reviewers review them and no money's exchanged, and then the papers go forward, hopefully for the editors to work on. Some editors are paid for this process, and then the manuscripts are then formally published in some way by the publisher. And this is a very large body of business, and is one that is quite profitable in some people's hands. Some of you may be aware of a newspaper called The Guardian, and they publish online long articles, and there's one here that was brought to my attention by Professor David Lloyd, who is the founder of the Veterinary Dermatology Journal, which highlights at times some of the concerns in the scientific world of the substantial profitability of publishing and the fact that a lot of the work that is done in publishing is done by the authors and the reviewers for free. But it has to be acknowledged that publishing is a critical part of anybody's professional life if you're involved in academia or in a veterinary specialty such as dermatology. And although most of what I'm going to say is focused on my experience based on dealing with the Veterinary Dermatology Journal, I hope that some of the comments I make are of value if you're looking to publish elsewhere. Now, this diagram illustrates the fairly seemingly complicated process that papers go through when they first submitted by an author, and we're going to unpick a little bit of this process as we go through the review process and a little bit about what happens once the paper has been hopefully accepted, some of the copy editing processes that go on. And I hope that this apparent complexity is not something that puts people off, but we do know that some authors struggle from the word go, even just trying to upload their manuscript into the system. There are a variety of systems used by the publishers for automating the process of manuscript submission, so you're usually looking at uploading various types of files which are then put together in a little package which then goes forward for assessment. And one of the first things to acknowledge is that most journals will have an editorial office, and that office will scrutinize the submission that's come through the software system, and they'll be looking through a checklist usually for various criteria that must be fulfilled before the manuscript can then be passed on to one of the editors, who will then be looking to find some reviewers. We are very much looking here at a formal peer review process, and in veterinary dermatology we actually make it double blind, so the authors don't know who's reviewed their paper and the reviewers don't know who the authors are. Now, there are a variety of models variations on that model that may become more popular in the future. But I suppose this reflects the fact that Veterinary Dermatology as a journal is very much a society-based journal. It's owned by the ESVD and it shares its copyright with the American College, and we have a fairly traditional model at the moment of peer review, a process that does go on, has come under some considerable scrutiny, as we'll touch upon in due course. Publication and so on. In recent years, there has been a publication that's available online called Writing for Publication in Veterinary Medicine, and this was put together by Mary Christopher and Karen Young, who are former chief editors of the journal Veterinary Clinical Pathology. And what they have done is they've put together a wealth of information. So if you wish to have more in detail about the publishing process, this is potentially a very valuable resource for you. It's now in its second edition and it was last published in 2014 and may indeed be ready for another update given the speed with which publishing processes are changing. So it's timely, I feel, that veterinarians are now able to have their own, hopefully bespoke guidance rather than trying to draw by extrapolation from what's going on in the human, medical or scientific fields. I often start my talks by talking about resources, and certainly the Writing for Publication document is a major resource. And I've hinted that publishing is a large commercial activity, and the publishers are all very keen to provide authors and reviewers and editors with a variety of web-based resources. I don't want this to be seen exclusively as a Wiley focused presentation, but I have to acknowledge that Wiley do provide a wide variety of author services, and there's one key issue I'll come back to a little bit later with respect to people who are writing in a second, where English is not their first language. That is quite important in the context of accessing resources for authors. This is just one example of the wide variety of resources that are available through the Wiley website, and Wiley is one of the major publishers of veterinary titles, and one of its colleagues in the veterinary publication field is Elsevier. They also publish a large number of veterinary titles, and they too have extensive resources for authors, for reviewers. And when I say authors, I'm thinking mainly of journal articles, but also for books as well, because despite the growth of online resources, vets still seem very keen to read textbooks and have them to handle. So some of you may be involved in that. So there are lots of resources there, but it has to be acknowledged that usually they're fairly generic, and they explain the processes that the publishers use, in particular the software programs they use, and some of the key factors that might be important when it comes to trying to make your paper stand above the rest and be noticed by prospective readers. And of course we rely very heavily on our publishers to help disseminate our journal articles, not just through the memberships of the various societies that might have a subscription with the journal, but also through the wealth of library packages that are used to give access to journals online. And I must admit, when I'm editing, I'm often thinking that I'm not only having a reader who's one of my colleagues, but also potentially readers who may be almost anywhere in the world. And so I don't want my articles to be parochial in any way, that hopefully they're nice and clear and can be understood by anybody who's got an interest in veterinary dermatology or whatever discipline it might be. So, let's think a little bit about what does the publishing process involve. Traditionally, for many authors, it's a focus on a scientific paper. And certainly working with undergraduate and postgraduate students and colleagues, that process of making a paper starts off with a question. And in order to clarify what that question is, we're going to say what's actually known, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And from our awareness of the literature, we can then say, okay, is there a hypothesis here that we'd like to explore? Is there a question we'd like to ask? And how could we answer that question? And that's where we plan the project work based on our knowledge of the literature. We then hopefully go through a process of devising a system of collecting data and think about a little bit about analysing that data, and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly. And then we move into the more discursive part of the paper where we talk about what our results might mean, how they could be best interpreted, and hopefully how they could be best used for furthering our understanding of an area. So these processes, what is known, formulation of a hypothesis and planning the project work, comprise, if you will, the introductory part of the paper. The data collection analysis is the methods and the results. And then the interpretation and speculation, to some extent, is something that occurs in the discussion phase of the paper. So some papers actually can lead to other communications. And indeed, hopefully your research will spawn further studies, and the circle will keep going round and developing more and more interesting questions, hopefully. But when we're getting started, we initially are thinking about a hypothesis, and it's at this point that things can go horribly wrong, potentially. Sometimes the question that's being asked can be inappropriately framed, and good intentions and enthusiasm need to be carefully regulated. And in that regard, it's often the case, certainly in academic institutions, like the one where I work, that you're normally working within a group of people, a research group, and they are going to scrutinize the hypothesis, the proposals that you have. Universities and other academic institutions often will have in-house systems for formal review, and certainly here we have a review at the school level before it then goes to the faculty level. And this review is not just to look at the ethical or legal or research animal implications of the work, but also to look at its feasibility, suitability. Is this a suitable proposal for study? Some organisations, and I think some of the veterinary colleges that do further qualifications, do potentially offer some resources in terms of scrutinising a study. And although it can be difficult because senior authors may not feel comfortable sharing their work with colleagues, there is considerable value potentially in offering a study proposal to an external group for scrutiny, because one doesn't wish to develop a hypothesis, start to explore it, and then find that you come unstuck because of unforeseen technical or practical problems which somebody else might have been able to show you. So whenever one sets up a hypothesis, it's very important that it is scrutinized internally and externally if possible before you embark on collecting the data. And then the other thing that I will do very strongly is encourage people to think about their data. Have you got enough data? Now, we can make the joke that as soon as you start a clinical study with animals, that the cases just disappear. They just stop coming through the clinic, and suddenly your projected numbers of animals of hundreds dwindles to tens of animals, and then your data analysis becomes very, very difficult. At the outset, I think it's important that one anticipates the data analysis that might be used, and that you access people who can actually provide that analysis. I'm very fortunate I have access to colleagues who are professional statisticians, and they can help shape the design of the study, and it's best for that discussion of what the analytical processes might be is carried out at the beginning. And I've noticed in recent years that some of the specialist practices that are doing veterinary dermatology. They are clearly developing a study that is carried out by clinicians, but they're clearly right at the outset working with a company, an organization, a professional group who will provide them with the statistical analysis and will help them to establish, if it was a clinical trial, for example, how many animals might be needed in order to see if there's a difference in response rates to two different products. So I can't emphasize enough that data analysis has to start thinking about it right at the beginning, and one has to be careful that you don't guess or overestimate how many animals or how many cases you're going or entities one is going to see, because that is sadly where some studies come unstuck, and they move from a major review to a small and therefore pilot study, which then has unfortunately the impression that it's not so useful as perhaps a larger scale study. In shaping that hypothesis, in shaping that focus, it's always assumed that you know what the literature tells us. And my colleagues at University of Nottingham and the Centre for Evidence-Based Veterinary Medicine, Marnie Brennan and Rachel Dean, published this paper with Douglas Grundley, who's someone who's looked very carefully at the various databases that vets often use when they're doing a literature search. Now, it has to be acknowledged that many people will do a Google Scholar or a PubMed search and that sort of thing to get a very quick glimpse of what's going on in the published literature. But I'll talk a little bit later about evidence-based medicine and critically appraised topics and the need to do systematic reviews of the literature. And in those, we usually have to use more than one data source. And what Douglas and colleagues found was that, certainly in the veterinary field, CAB abstracts has a much broader coverage of the literature than many other databases, and that therefore, in order to do an effective literature search, one is obliged to use several databases. One doesn't wish to be caught out by a reviewer turning around saying, this has already been published in several places already. Hopefully that won't happen, but it is incumbent on the authors, when you're planning a study, to do a very thorough literature search to help you establish the question and use several databases and think about using CAB as one of them as a minimum. Now, in thinking about the hypothesis and the introduction to the paper and why you're going to do things, when it actually comes to us as an editor or you're sending out to a reviewer, you're thinking, what's the reader going to see? Is the reader going to see something that they feel they ought to know? That's something that's important, that's going to matter to them? So that obviously has some bearing on where you're going to submit your publication, because the reader is going to be different in different journals and different publications. Some people have used W words to sort of emphasize what's going on in publication, and so one of them is, so what? What is the point of this paper? Does it really help us? Does it take us forward? Does it tell us anything new? Does it excite me? Does it shed any light on an old disease, for example? Now, we can be a little bit sarcastic about that, but I think we have a duty of care when we receive material from our prospective authors to be clear that if we're not excited by the study, by the paper, that we can make clear what the concerns are. And sometimes we return papers because it's not clear what the authors are trying to say. It's quite sad sometimes when some authors will put within their work the impression that this is going to save the world. They over-egg, they over-impress what their work is going to do. Quite often, it's better just to tone things down and just describe what you've done and put it in context. If you wish to make great claims about your work, that's probably more relevant if you were doing a research grant application. For a scientific paper, it just has to be very simply, what did you do and why? And hopefully the results will have great value to people. They may show that something doesn't work, and therefore you need to do further studies of a diagnostic technique or a therapeutic intervention based on perhaps what may be perceived to be negative results. Negative results are okay. In clinical journals such as Veterinary Dermatology, we're often thinking that the main reader is going to be a clinician, so the clinician says, what's this going to do for me in general clinical practice? Will it affect what I do? I put at the bottom, does it have implications for evidence-based veterinary medicine? In recent years, this area of activity has increased enormously, and I think we have to accept that authors and editors have a duty of care to try and put into the public domain material that can help to underpin the evidence base when people come to ask specific questions. Some of you may appreciate that, sadly, sometimes the evidence base for some of the things that we do is very, very slim. And so even if results of a study might be negative, that can all help to build the evidence base as we try and make our clinical work and activities more evidence-based, not just for our own sake, but for the sake of the people that own the animals that come to us. One of the W words, which publication? Where am I going to try and publish this? Who do I want to read this? Do I want vets to read this? Do I want specialist vets? Do I want clinicians who are general practitioners? Do I want owners to look at this stuff? When I say peers, I'm thinking of if you're a specialist vet in some discipline, is it your specialist vet peers who you want to reach out to? Now, it has to be acknowledged that previous experience of publishing can have a big impact on authors' choice. Some people find the experience of submitting a paper quite painful, and that may put them off from submitting to a journal in the future. And in academia, certainly, there is a major drive for the impact factors to dictate where you try and publish stuff. But it's sad in the sense that is such a major driver, because in many cases, when somebody comes to me with an idea for a publication, I'm trying to work out who are they trying to tell? Why is this work important? And that will dictate where they're going to submit it. So, for example, some studies are clearly of value to a wide variety of people. So it may be that you can go for an international journal, or it may be that you're describing a disease that's quite rare, that it's very focal, it's only found in one geographical area, and therefore it might be more relevant to submit that to a national journal rather than an international journal. So I think one has to be careful about the choice of your publication, where you're going to put your material. I appreciate that for many people, especially starting out in publishing, that you're simply trying to get published because you need that in order to be able to sit postgraduate exams. And in that regard, you may be less concerned about where you publish it as much as it's actually just published. Historically, costs were a factor for some authors, so you used to have to pay for illustrations and page charges. Those have disappeared somewhat and been replaced largely by the burgeoning field of open access. Now, open access is a topic we could discuss for the rest of the afternoon. It's quite a complicated area, and it is one that for some veterinarians is quite a daunting area, because the fees that can be charged for some journals can be quite substantial. But open access fees do provide a platform for making your work much more widely available. If you're thinking about a publication title, you're not sure if they're going to take your article, if you're really not sure, before you format it for the journal, before you submit it, just ask the editor. Send an email to the editor and say, I've got this study, I've got this case report, might you be interested? And then if they hopefully say yes or no, you can move on fairly quickly. But if you're not sure, the editor should be there to respond to those kind of inquiries. There are lots of different publication formats. Scientific study for most people is the primary focus if you're trying to get promotion in an academic environment. Clinicians are very focused on case reports because that tells them a lot about their clinical work. Review articles are commissioned, certainly for veterinary dermatology, from time to time, and they can be very, very valuable. But there's a variety of other types of manuscripts. There's letters, there's even quizzes, and even editorials can be quite challenging to develop and to present. And then in recent years, we've had the evidence-based medicine approach of critically appraised topics, which are becoming more and more popular and have a particular format. So it depends who you're trying to tell, and what sort of things you're trying to tell that will influence which choice of publication format you want. And also in increasing years, we've had the growth of supporting information. Some people call this supplementary information. This is the material that doesn't appear in the print version or the PDF version online of the article, but is extra information that can be incredibly important for other people to be able to repeat your work. It will show the hard data, so you can do further statistical analysis. You can put lots more diagrams in and tables of data, of raw data. You can even put videos in, for example. And for some journals, that's quite a critical part of the article. There may only be 3 or 4 pages of the actual main text, but there's a wealth of material in the supporting information. That's something we're looking at more and more to see how that material is presented, to make sure that it's nice and clear to our readership. And often the supporting information is freely available to everybody. It's actually online permanently, so again, we have to be careful what that material contains. So this is not printed, and it's freely available on the web. Also, in considering your publication, you have to think about, are there any ethical guidelines that have an impact on what you're trying to do here and how you're going to present the information. So in the human field, there's the consort guidelines for reporting clinical trials. So in the human field, this has been a mandatory process for many years. In the veterinary field, the adoption of these sort of reporting trials criteria has been very limited, but it is slowly coming through. The paper on the right is a study that we published quite a few years ago, which, as you can notice, Howell Williams' name is there. So Howell supported us in doing a systematic review of the literature looking for how to treat atopic dermatitis in dogs using consort guidelines and the software that Cochrane provide in order to do the analysis of clinical trials in order to come up with good quality evidence that different drugs may or may not work. Now, the adoption of reporting guidelines has been relatively limited in the veterinary field so far. The REFLECT statement is a reporting system with guidelines, and on the right here we have a table of the criteria that are used to evaluate the paper once it comes in. So clinical trials in livestock and food safety require authors to follow these control trial guidelines. So if you're doing a study on a randomized controlled trial, you can't put the information together haphazardly. You must be seen to follow these guidelines. Now, the legal coverage of these guidelines is difficult. Authors tend to do what they want, but increasingly people are trying to get authors to follow these guidelines. So in the large animal livestock field, we have the REFLECT statement. In the human field, there are guidelines for case reports. So this is a publication that has been published in several different journals, which highlights the guidelines that have been adopted in the human field. And again, you've got a table explaining what criteria need to be addressed when you write your case report. Now, at the moment, we don't have formally acceptable, validated guidelines that have been authorised for use in the veterinary field for either case reports, which are a major part of what people do, nor for clinical trials in the companion animal field. It is something that people are looking at, and if those come through in some shape or form, authors and editors will have a duty of care to be aware of them, because this, again, hopefully helps to build the evidence base in a formal way, that information is collected and delivered in a systematic way so that we can all learn together, so that it makes best use of the resources when people are doing these studies. So when you're doing clinical trials in particular, it's important to be aware that there could be some guidelines that could influence what you're trying to do. We have a duty of care to also think about the animals that we're going to use, and there are guidelines on the International Association of Vet Editors website. There are research animal guidelines called ARRIVE, which are well published. And one area that's coming through of contention is the use of pets, client-owned animals. These are often used in studies, and we often ask for permission to be given by the owner, and that's acknowledged in the paper. But there's quite a lot of ethical debate about the merits of doing studies in client-owned animals. And it means that we're actually looking more and more closely about the ethical review process that practices or academic institutions are applying when it comes to use of people's pet animals. And it's important to be aware that permission may not be enough. If people go through formal institutional or ethical review, journals have an obligation and a duty, if they're not comfortable with the processes that the animals have gone through, to actually say, we're not happy to publish this information, that we have ethical concerns about that. This is a conversation that for veterinary dermatology has come into focus fairly recently, but is a discussion that most veterinarians have to think about, particularly if you're putting client-owned animals through various procedures. Another ethical obligation that we have that was highlighted by Hal Williams a few years ago is conflicts of interest. And this, for me, is quite an important topic because many veterinarians, particularly in veterinary dermatology, if they're involved in academia or in specialist practice, many of them are heavily involved in working closely with various pharmaceutical companies and therefore inevitably will have potential conflicts of interest. But that's not a problem. The key issue here is that there are various activities that authors and presenters may have that puts them in a potential position of being influenced by those circumstances. But the critical thing is that the degree to which that behaviour has been influenced in relation to the declared conflict can only be judged by those in the audience. So that means that the author or a presenter of a paper has to declare all possible conflicts at the start of a talk or start of an article, and then allow the audience to make a judgment. Now, this is something I've been very keen to promote in recent years in journals I've worked with. It's an area that's quite sensitive because people may feel that they don't have conflicts of interest, but potentially any particular pharmaceutical company links can potentially cause a conflict of interest. That's not a problem. But if you declare it, then the reader can make that assessment and wonder if the paper might have been influenced by that link. So what sort of links might these be? Well, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors for many years has provided guidelines on this. And there are some examples here of what conflicts of interest might include. So it might be you get a research grant, you might get paid for giving a lecture or going on a conference and giving a key lecture, for example, and getting expenses. There's a wide variety of ways in which companies can provide financial support to key opinion leaders, to leading veterinarians. All of these activities are fine so long as they're declared, and it's particularly critical for the authors that they do declare this at the outset. But what one has to also consider is that reviewers can have conflicts of interest. So, for example, there may have been occasions in the past when I've been asked to review a paper and I feel that I'm conflicted because I have a favourable or unfavourable view of a particular pharmaceutical company or author group or area of study, and have to say, I'm sorry, I can't review this with confidence that I'm not in some way biased. Similarly, editors have a duty of care to be careful about their own conflicts of interest. So this conflict of interest is not just a responsibility for the author, it's one that the reviewers and the editors need to consider as well. And one of the other dilemmas we have is how long do you declare conflicts for? So we have a sort of unwritten rule almost in veterinary dermatology that authors will say in the past 5 years I have worked for and I have received from. And that's sort of an empirical way of looking at it. And finishing off on publishing guidelines, Wiley, like other publishers, have brought together publishing ethics. They have this article, which is again in its second edition, which covers a range of ethical issues. And given the pressure to publish, the enormous pressure for some people to publish, ethical issues are going to get more and more and more important, how we cover these. And one arena that discusses the pressures on authors is COPE. So this is the Committee on publication ethics, and this is an international organisation based in the UK, and it provides lots of guidance to editors, to reviewers, and to authors about what our roles and responsibilities are in an ethical domain. And here's a nice one: who qualifies for authorship? We'll talk about that shortly. Lou, I think it's over to you now.
Yes. So we're just going to ask you a quick poll before we go to the next part of our session. So the question that we're asking, and hopefully this should have appeared on your screen, is have you published an article in peer-reviewed journal? Yes, 1 to 3 articles in any peer-reviewed journal. Yes, 4 to 6 articles. Yes, 7 or more articles, or no. So if you can complete that for me, that would be fabulous. And we'll share the results so you can see what people are answering who are joining the webinar. I'm just going to have a look myself. So I can see at the moment that we have about 67% have said no, that they haven't published an article in a peer-reviewed journal. We have about 17% that have said yes, and we have about 17% that say yes for 7 or more articles. Sorry, the first one I meant to say was for 1 to 3. So I'll give you about 10 seconds more to place your answers. And I'll now publish it for you so you can see it. And then we'll end the session. So that's that poll ended. So thank you so much for taking the time to complete that. If the poll is still showing on your screen, you can simply press the cross. All of our polls aren't mandatory, so you can close them down if you don't want to answer them. So thanks very much. Handing back over to you, Aiden.
Thank you, Lou. So these are the guidelines that ICMJE publish for authorship. Authors traditionally are making a substantial contribution to the paper. They draft the paper and they approve the paper when it's submitted. And recently they've added this additional 4th clause, which is that you are all accountable for all aspects of the work and ensuring that questions relating to the accuracy or integrity are appropriately investigated and resolved. Now that sadly reflects the fact that there can be disputes over authorship and publication. So these are the 4 criteria that many people will follow. And over here I've put securing funding, providing equipment, supervising the whole research group. This alone does not justify people to become authors. Now there are major cultural issues here, and some authors are naturally added on because they are the senior person in the research group or in the laboratory. Some people recommend that it probably only amounts to 6 people who actually do most within a study. So once you get beyond 6 authors, you have to then start questioning what did the other people do. We do occasionally challenge author groups and try and clarify what they have actually contributed to the paper. It is a contentious area, and what I would say at this point, perhaps as best practice, is that if you're concerned about authorship, it's a discussion to have right at the beginning of starting the paper, when you're starting the study. So when you're actually even doing the data analysis, you're working out who your collaborators are, who you're going to acknowledge, and who's going to be a co-author, to hopefully avoid any disputes at a later date. Now, this is one of Karen Moriello's pictures from the internet about the peer review process. And I hinted earlier that some people have quite an unpleasant experience with some journals and therefore won't go back to them to submit an article. It is a challenging area, and particularly if you're new to publishing. And I think the key thing is not to try and take things too personally. There are due processes to follow. And the first thing is to think about the instructions to authors. All journals have them published on their websites. They vary tremendously in terms of depth and length and detail. But if you don't read the fine print, you're going to miss a key issue, potentially. And that, unfortunately, sends signals to us as editors and reviewers that you actually haven't paid that much attention, and therefore you don't really care that much about how it's presented. Or worse still, you've tried to publish it elsewhere, you've barely reformatted it according to the guidelines for the journal you're now putting it into, and it becomes apparent that this has been sent somewhere because the formatting is all wrong. If you read this sign very carefully, you'll realise that the bridge is out ahead. And so I would encourage anybody, if they're thinking about publishing an article in a journal, you look at the instructions to authors and you look at the most recent version of the journal to see how the material's been presented. Those two things help to shed a lot of light on how the paper can be more easily go through the review process. So papers are returned without review because the authors haven't followed the guidelines. And this is something the editorial office will look at. They'll look at a checklist and say they haven't formatted the article references properly, they haven't followed the general guidelines. So, for example, we still get some papers where the papers are double spaced for line for the Word document. Double spacing was used years ago when people used to print articles out and annotate them by hand when they were editing them. Many journals don't use that approach now. A quick comment about references. Many authors use software such as EndNote or Reference Manager to formulate their references in the paper, but you can get stuck with mistakes there, and I quite often find little errors. So you do have to check the references very, very carefully, because in fact as authors you're ultimately responsible for them. And many journals won't meticulously check every single reference to make sure that it's accurate. There are problems sometimes with references in the context of non-peer-reviewed materials, so unpublished data, personal communications, proceedings of articles, proceedings of meetings and so on. Those sometimes don't stand up to scrutiny by some reviewers or editors, so it is important to be clear when you're putting them in as references that there's been discussion with the editors about whether that sort of material is acceptable. Copyright can cause lots of problems with some authors. It's a document that people often just sign and submit. It's important to read the small print, particularly with respect to images, because quite often in journals the copyright is transferred to the publisher. There are rules and regulations about how you can use the images, but many people will often use the images without any awareness of their copyright responsibilities. Articles, when they're submitted, are converted into PDF and HTML formats, and it's important that you check the content of those to make sure that the article looks like what you think it should look like. So the papers come in. Now I want to just talk a little bit about what then happens. And the first thing that happens is that the paper's are pointed to an editor who then sends it out to reviewers. And people then say, okay, who are the reviewers? Well, they're often people who we may personally know if you're an author, and some authors actually will say, can you not send it to Mr. Bloggs or Mrs. Smith or whatever. And there are increasing efforts from a variety of platforms to try and provide systems to allow reviewers to get due recognition of the work that they do. As I said at the beginning, they do this for free, but it must be acknowledged that this is a very, very, very valuable continuing education or CPD process. Many reviewers enjoy immensely reviewing papers, learning about topics, searching the literature, searching through the references. So it is a win-win situation potentially. But there are other responsibilities that reviewers have. Some of them do review several papers, and if that happens, if anybody reviews a paper for VetDerm, you might get a certificate sent to you to acknowledge the contribution that you've made to the work of the journal. And so this is an attempt to recognise what you're doing. And it's quite clear that reviewers have different modes of operation, and we have tried quite hard to give people checklists to work through things they need to think about when they're looking at a paper. And again, Wiley and others publishing houses will provide a wealth of information about what the reviewer's processes should be, what's expected of you in generic terms. We don't formally train reviewers, but there is information there on the web to think about when it comes to reviewing a paper. One of the first things you can consider doing when you review is looking at it and thinking, does the text make sense? Is it well written? Is it ambiguous? And this is, I'm afraid, where in international journals we can run into some major problems where it becomes abundantly clear that the English writing is very poorly presented because the person is not a native English speaker. And sadly, when we ask authors to use a native English speaker, they will barely make much difference to the text because I think they're wary of changing the intended meaning, and they're frightened of upsetting the authors. And this is where some groups, and I'm going to be careful how I say this because it may seem a bit unfair to single out one particular country, but the Japanese, for example, are extremely adept at using, I suspect, professional and other bodies. So the English that comes from the Japanese groups that we see is impeccable. And we appreciate that because it makes it easier to look at the content of the manuscript and look at the science. Some people feel that it's not the job of the author to worry too much about the grammar and the syntax and all the rest of it, that somehow the copy editor will do that. Copy editors work to what's called a style sheet. They're making the document, the manuscript, if it's accepted, converting it into a format that the journal has agreed upon in the past. They are not looking at the scientific content. They're not looking at the meaning or so much. They are limited in what they can do to improve the English. So that often comes back to the editors actually having to revise the style and formatting of the document. But in general, it has to be acknowledged that the reviewer is not there to add 30 pages of corrections of spellings or mistakes in grammar or whatever. It's mainly about the scientific content that we want feedback on. And it's very straightforward things like the title. What does the title tell us? Many readers don't read beyond the title. The title's got to accurately present what you're talking about, so you have to think carefully about that. And then there's things like conflicts of interest. Is that declared? That tends to be picked up by editors, but reviewers sometimes pick this up as well. A commercially orientated study is obviously going to have some suspicion that there ought to be some declaration of sponsorship, so you have to give your sources of funding. And then the abstract. Does that really summarize everything? Several years ago, we adopted a fairly formalized format for presenting the abstract because we wanted to make it easy for readers to get in and out very quickly to see what the content was. Rather than one big block paragraph, you can actually see what the methods, the results, and the conclusions were. Readers don't have much time. They've only got 250 words there. They want to get in and out quickly. So your abstract's got to be very carefully constructed if possible. And then, as we've hinted, is the paper of value, of interest to the field of concern. Now, some reviewers feel very strongly that some papers are totally outside the remit of the journal. There's a difficulty there because usually the editor assumes that it's potentially within the field of the journal, so there may be a little bit of difficulty there. I hinted about the international readership earlier. Is this paper suitable for a wide audience, or is it only bespoke because in England, in a certain region, they have this weird skin disease in humans? That only needs to go into a national journal, perhaps. But maybe the findings are really novel, and you want to share that with other people. And when you put the introduction together, it's not meant to be a literature review. It's meant to be short and concise and clear how you got to your hypothesis and what your aims and objectives were within the study. The method should be so clear that you should be able to repeat the study from the paper. Somebody else should be able to repeat it. And sometimes the methods are out of date, sometimes they're inappropriate, and this is partly where the ethical review comes in. Sometimes things are done to animals that we feel are not appropriate. And then you present the results. How are you going to do that? Are you going to use tables? Are you going to use text? Are you going to use diagrams? We don't want duplication, but there may be a variety of ways in which one can do this. And I suppose a very good example of this is if you look at microbiome papers, they provide a wealth of software presentations for different ways of presenting a lot of data. And they can be quite difficult to understand sometimes, and people have different ways of looking at information and results. So one does have to think carefully about how are you trying to present the information, and be prepared that sometimes we actually have to remove some of this information because you may have had some duplication. If you describe in detail the results in your figures or graphs, we may not need to include the graphs. Now, this is a very complicated slide, and what I propose to do is to actually leave it in the presentation for those of you who may wish to come back to it. This slide is a summary slide that was prepared by my colleague Karen Moriello, and it helps to highlight how you might approach the discussion. Now, the discussion can often be overlong in some articles, and we actually have to tease it back a little bit. But I hope that some of you will find this a useful way of constructing your discussions in the future. It helps the reader to understand the processes that you've gone through, and it's quite important, actually, in the discussion to be clear about what you're trying to say, because sometimes this is where you can be quite speculative and you can start to develop new hypotheses. And this is where you can really get the reader engaged and think, right, maybe that's an area I need to take forward and study myself. So that the discussion's got to be logical, it's got to be sequential, and it's got to be clear about the weaknesses of the study and the future prospects. So for those of you particularly keen, I'll leave you to look at that in due course. And then the references, are they up to date? Are they from refereed sources? Manuscripts are not review papers unless they're formally presented as such. So we often find we actually have to remove references because people over-reference things trying to bolster their study potentially. We often notice the format's not been followed that's been described, and as I hinted, you've got a responsibility as an author to be accurate in the use of references so that readers can find the material you've referenced in future. I find it nothing more infuriating when you're trying to find a paper and they've got the volume or the year or the page spread wrong, or worse still, the title's wrong because you can't find it on a web search. So it is important that we get the references accurate so that the reader can go back to that material. A major area in a journal like Veterinary Dermatology, and it applies to other journals as well, is the use of images. These have a major role to play in many veterinary disciplines because they present clinical or histopathology material. Certainly on some websites there's lots of guidance about how to prepare images, and some journals actually provide software that assesses the quality of the images, and that report can be quite valuable. It's very easy to use digital cameras, it's very easy to use mobile phones, but they often collect images in a compressed format which actually doesn't lend itself readily to use in a print journal, and sometimes not in an online journal. Print journals print in CMYK color format. Many systems collect images in RGB format, and many authors struggle to convert between these two unless they've got a good knowledge of software such as Adobe Photoshop. Many images are at the inappropriate size and they come in compressed and unsuitable for inclusion. So it's important to read the author guidelines and how to present material. The dot per inch is a guide to how granular the material is within an image, and most printers will use 300 dpi, the minimum database. And I would recommend that you set the camera settings on the very high definition, so when you initially photograph something, you get a very, very, very high quality, very large image, very large file, which you can then use for further conversion into a version that can be submitted to a journal, for example. I've mentioned professional services. This is a family friend who gave this little cartoon. There are people around who will do cartoons. Some of you, if you read the Journal of Veterinary Dermatology, may recognize this very stylized cat picture, which is a hallmark of Marcel Kowalek, who's a veterinarian who specializes in dermatology, but is also a scientific artist. And there are a few people around who can help you with this sort of material if that's the content of your manuscript deserves it. So there are a few people around who are worth asking for advice there. Very quick question, what's wrong with this picture? This picture is taken from a journal. It's taken from a few years back. Most of you will know this is a Sarcoptes mite. What's wrong with this? Well, it's all wrong formatting-wise. It's yellow background. It should be a white background. That's one formal guide. The mite should be head up this way. Here's a gravid mite with an egg inside it. But you might ask the question, do you actually need that picture? And that's something to take into account when you're presenting a manuscript. Do you need all those pictures? Are they really essential? Could they actually go to supporting information? Could they be placed there? So you don't lose the picture from the article, they're just not in the print version. Histopathology, major area for dermatology. Conventions that you put the epidermis at the top of the slide and it's horizontal, that you can see the cellular debris, and if you're going to put details about the cell types and the arrows, that you can see that information very clearly, and that the background is white. For some papers, this information, the histopathology, is absolutely critical. Without it, you can't be sure that the people are describing the disease they're really talking about. So here is an old picture from an old version of Veterinary Dermatology What's wrong with it? The epidermis is off to the right. It should be uppermost. The picture's actually very, very dark. This is how it looks in the journal. And it describes cells in the legend, and you can barely make out what these cells are. Here is a more recent example. The material above the slide is bright white, so you've got a white background. The epidermis is uppermost, it's horizontal, it's at the top of the image, and it may not be readily apparent on the slide, but certainly in the print version of this article and online, where there's an arrow there, for example, you can actually work out what those cells are, as they're described in the legend. Image quality is challenging for many authors, particularly if they're not based in academia, because they don't have access to the software to do these kind of manipulations. But it is an important issue to think about well before you submit the article, because we may find we have to do lots of revisions of it at a later date. So many of you will be familiar with Adobe Photoshop. There are other software images systems you can use, so ImageJ and GIMP are some. We're fortunate because we have local colleagues who are co-authors who are very good at dealing with images. We have technical staff who are familiar with using photography software programs. Generically, publishers will offer some help as well. And if you are thinking about using somebody else's images, don't forget to think about the copyright issues that may apply to that. Going back to the review process, reviewers actually tend to look at the scientific content of the paper. They don't actually think too much about the image quality. A few people do. And just to say a little bit more about why do papers seem to get stuck sometimes in review, it's either because we can't find reviewers or reviewers are slow at sending their information back because they're busy people. The other thing to take home is that editors use reviewers' comments to help make them make a decision. We do sadly see a few authors who say, I would like to have another reviewer look at my paper because you've had differences in opinion about my paper, potentially. Certainly we can ask statisticians or photographers or specialist scientists to look at certain features of a paper, but authors have to understand that the editors use the reviewers to help come to a decision. It must also be acknowledged that if we're going to reject a paper, that's not done lightly. Most journals are going to look at a paper carefully in a group and potentially make a group decision that on balance we feel this paper isn't acceptable and sadly reject it, and then hopefully make it clear why we've rejected it. So authors need to be aware that having 6 or 7 reviewers isn't going to help get your paper through. It's all about accepting that reviewers shed light on a paper and offer a recommendation. That's not to undermine at all the incredible reliance we have on our reviewers. And hopefully they allow us to accept subject to copy editing. That's always an exciting time. For some authors it's got to go back for a bit of revision. Some papers do get revised prior to review because you've not followed the author guidelines, but one of the major areas of concern for some authors is not the reject or reject without review. Hopefully your paper's got in, but it's had a lot of revision, and it says revision major, no commitment. So these are standard decision processes. We as editors have an obligation to explain to you why is it a major revision. It may not be that the paper's got problems, it just needs a lot of work doing on it to make it even better when it comes back. So and for credentials, for going to do your postgraduate exams, you obviously want an accept. So when the paper comes back to you with reviewers' decisions and editors' recommendations, it can be quite difficult to cope with that, particularly if you're new to publishing. It's actually quite normal to feel upset when it says major review or even minor review. Certainly very upsetting when it says reject. It's worth reviewing the reviewers' and editors' comments in detail, but perhaps just let the dust settle in your mind before you come back to it. And it's important to acknowledge you've received the review, that you actually want to submit the paper at a later date. But do think twice before you start doing the revision, trying to be a bit more objective about it. Howell Williams again. So Howell published this paper in the Blue Journal back in 2004, and it describes what to do when you get a paper back from an editor. And the 3 take-home messages, really. When you respond to the reviewer's comments, consider these 3 golden rules. Respond completely, answer all the questions that have been raised, respond politely, and respond with evidence if you feel that you're going to be at variance with what the editors have come up with. some people return their papers with a stout defence of their, and people even call it a rebuttal of the referee and editor's comments. It doesn't have to be a rebuttal. It's meant to be fairly polite, and it may be that you say, we thank the reviewers for their comments, but we politely don't agree with this because of X, Y, and Z. So there is an etiquette there, and if you want to find out more, have a look at Hal's paper. So that's a process to go through. Now, when a paper actually gets accepted, the editors may actually make quite a lot of changes to it because the images need improving, or there needs to be various formatting changes. When it then goes to production, the production editor does further work on it in conjunction with the typesetters. There's also a copy editor involved who meticulously goes through the manuscript, making sure that the spellings are correct and things like that. And they often will come up with questions that then come back to you in the proof that you then have to answer. All being well, those get answered, and then your paper goes to what's called a DOI, a digital object identifier. That means basically it's ready to be published, and it's moved into an abstract database, into PubMed or what have you, and there it is. It's out there, and in some journals it's printed, and some of you I know feel very proud when you see it in print. But once it's online, it's essentially published, and it's done and dusted. So, and that's always a pleasant experience when you get to that stage. Right, that brings me to the end of my part of the presentation. I'm conscious that we have another poll, so I'm going to hand back to Lou.
Aiden, thank you so much for those fantastic insights today. I hope that you all managed to pick up some tips and advice there to help you with your publishing. Now, we're going to ask you a quick little poll here. I'm conscious that we've run over a little bit, but that's fine because it's a recorded session. So if there's anything you've missed, or if you join late, because I saw some people join late, then you can simply watch this recording. So that's no problem. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to ask you this question. Now, what we'd like to know here, that given that you've just had this presentation session, do you feel confident publishing your next article? So if you can answer yes, or yes, but would like some more guidance, or no, we would love to hear from you. Okay, so I can see that people are answering. And I'm just going to give you a few seconds more to do make sure you put your answer in. It's not mandatory, so if you have pressed the cross button to close it, then it will close it. And I'm just going to refresh. And let's see. Okay, so we have, and I'm going to publish these for you now so you can see as well. So we've got 9% that said no. And then yes, we've got 36%, and then yes, but would like some more guidance, we have got 55%. So fantastic. Thank you so much for everyone for answering that poll. What I'm going to do now is we're going to run through a couple of questions that we've had from people to make sure that we get those answered. If you do have any additional questions that we don't manage to get to answer, don't worry, we can send you a response after this session. Remember, this recording is available, or sorry, not right now because it's live, but this recording will be available on wileyauthors.com/webinars. Okay, so let's have a look. I'm just going to make sure that that poll is ended, so it should disappear from your screen if it hasn't already. Right, Aiden, the first question I have is, if you don't have statisticians to hand, who else is best to ask about study design for the best data?
Well, I'd perhaps go back to the comments I made earlier that certainly in-house we've got access to people who do statistics. We do know that there are people who are professional statisticians that one may be able to access via Wiley Author Services or self-employed people who offer statistical support. There is obviously inevitably a financial cost to that, which perhaps is worth taking into consideration when one is planning the project, that you may actually have to put some money into consultancy fees for the statistical analysis. We do use people who are knowledgeable on statistics to check the statistical analysis, because most of us, it has to be admitted, struggle with statistical methods. But unfortunately, there aren't readily available, to my knowledge, readily available external sources unless you're prepared to pay something towards that. I guess that's also where sometimes it's worth considering if it's possible to extend the remit of the study, perhaps with another group or an institution where they do have access to statistical support. Statisticians tend to be in great demand, unfortunately, so they can be very, very busy. But I think one has to be careful how you deal with that, because sometimes people might try and use simple statistics when in fact a more complex modeling, for example, is a complex area where you may need expert input. So I'm afraid it's a case of perhaps thinking I need to put some money aside for some consultancy fees, potentially, if I don't have access immediately to a statistician in-house.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. The other question I have here is, I'd like to be involved in the reviewing process. How can I be trained or start collaborating?
Right. I've kind of hinted that it's actually quite challenging to be formally trained. It tends to be by experience that people become accomplished at reviewing. One thing I can mention is that if people are invited to review journals such as Vet Derm, when a decision's made, the comments, the views, the details of the other reviewer are shared with the first reviewer. And that can be quite insightful, because quite often reviewers look at things in a very different way and see different things within a paper. So that's one way in which people learn, looking at other people's comments on that particular paper, getting feedback from the editor, hopefully, if there are issues. In order to get invited to be a reviewer, that's quite tricky potentially, because in a sense what you have to do is put yourself forward. And we do have people who do that. We do occasionally have people who are very keen to put themselves forward and may send a short CV, may explain that they've what their area of expertise might be, and if to be fair, what I would say there is that I think that when people are keen to offer their services, because, as I've hinted, it's a timely process, it shouldn't be onerous, because most papers are not that long and they shouldn't take days, they should take several hours to review. But I know some people find it extremely daunting to review a paper. But if somebody puts themselves forward, then I would hope that a journal would say, thank you very much, and give them an opportunity, and then see what sort of material comes back. And if it's a good quality journal, I would like to think that the editorial team will then give feedback, because I've certainly noticed with some of the people who've started reviewing, sometimes they follow the list of issues that we want to be addressed, but they might say yes or no, give very simple answers. We have other people who write reams and reams and reams of material that we don't actually need, but we just need short, succinct responses to various aspects, like is the title accurate, and so on. So I would suggest if you're interested in exploring it, and of course it's perhaps no secret that similarly people who are reviewers then wish to put themselves forward for editorial board membership, because that's an honour in itself as well. But if you're on the editorial board of many journals, that's because you review papers. So if you're keen to become a reviewer, I guess you could argue that one of the benefits might be that you may become an editorial board member as well. So I would say write to the editor and introduce yourself, and see how you get on that way.
Great. And we do also have more information that's available on wileypeerreview.com, or under the resources tab. If you go to Wiley Author Services, there's loads of really good stuff in there. The same person actually just made a comment for you, Aiden. It just said the problem with being invited to review is that if you're from a developing country, so non-US or Europe or Japan, it's difficult to reach the editors and be considered. But thanks, I would love to be involved. I don't know if they're asking you there.
Well, we do get, I mentioned there's a thing called an editorial office. Most journals have an editorial office, so there'll be somewhere, usually in the author guidelines, that there'll be or on the website, there'll be a point of contact. There'll be an email address. In the case of Wiley, that'll be for vet dermatology. There should be an email address there. And so what people do is they write in there. So not only do we get invitations from people who say, I'd love to do a review, or I'd like to become an editorial board member, we actually have those requests of, I'd like to write a review article for you on X or Y. So it shouldn't be too difficult for somebody to send an email to the editorial office, because then that gets forwarded normally straight onto the editorial team. So there should be a fairly straightforward conduit where somebody can actually explain briefly the context. And the editorial assistants are very, very experienced in my view at dealing with these sort of inquiries, and they can sometimes sift out issues where it's clear somebody's not genuine. But a genuine email, I would like to think, would get through. Yeah.
I've got someone who's got a question here. I'm not sure if you can help with this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. I've submitted an article for a disease only, supposed to be in Northern Hemisphere.
Yes.
When I sent it, it was rejected, and the suggestion was to publish in a local journal, despite that the disease is something that's a global one, impossible to incur in the tropics. Is that a normal rule for tropical reports, that they may be rejected, or do you want to know?
What I would... It's not clear, and it doesn't really matter that it's actually been submitted specifically to veterinary dermatology. What I would say at this point is that it can often be perceived that editors reject or accept papers, and that's a kind of a binary thing that people might perceive. But increasingly, I feel for our journal, and I'm sure the same happens elsewhere, because this is where we've got the concept from, is that editors, if they do their job, they look at a paper after it's accepted, hopefully, and they edit it in a certain way, and they hopefully improve it. And quite often authors will say, thank you for improving my paper, and so on. There's a perception for some people that we are gatekeepers, that we say, don't like that, go away, I'll shut the gate. Oh, I do like that, I'll open the gate, in you come. Now, there are some guidelines, and I emphasize the word guidelines. They're not laws, they're not legislation. And this is where it can be tricky for some authors, because what happens is that something might come in and we might go, ooh, do we really want to think about that? And then if there's uncertainty, there'll be discussion. And there might be a consensus that says, yes, let's look at that, or no, on balance, we don't think that's suitable. But it's not a hard and fast rule. So if somebody's not sure that it's suitable because of the location, I would rather somebody submit it. Submit the abstract and a cover letter to say, this is something we're thinking of publishing. Would you be prepared to consider it? In fact, I met a colleague today who's from a country in Africa, and she said, I don't know if you take papers from our country. And I said, well, I have to look at the paper. So I would like to think that it's based on merit. It's not drilled down through region, or because, I mean, there are, for example, generic rules of along the lines of disease X has been seen in these breeds of dogs. If we see it in a new breed of dog, is that valuable? Is that novel? Well, sometimes it is because the diagnostic technique or the therapy was novel, not that it was a new breed of dog with it. So I would like to think that we would look at things in the round, and yes, if it's a disease that's very focal to one particular part of a country, it may not be relevant for our journal, because our readers want to know. So, for example, there are diseases that seem localized to certain areas of the world, or they're best described in certain areas of the world, and they may not be seen very often elsewhere. But that's where being an international journal is a challenge, because you're trying to sort of manage the readership's expectation, but the readership is spread all over the world.
Yeah.
So I'd rather we had the chance to look at a paper, and it may be that if it was declined, there's a variety of reasons for that, but it won't necessarily just be that it seems to be localized to one part of the world.
Great. You may have noticed, those that are attending, that I've added a poll up just to to rate the webinar. We've had some wonderful comments come through, and do add any comments to the questions section. The last question I have for you, Aiden, before we do the last couple of slides and finish off the presentation is, what sort of papers is veterinary dermatology most interested in at the moment?
At the moment, okay, well, straight off the top of my head, I would say there's been a dramatic development in the past few years with the introduction of the isoxazoline compounds, and these are licensed for treatment of a variety of ectoparasites. They seem to have the propensity to treat a lot of other ectoparasites across a wide variety of species, so I think that that's something we need to be mindful of. In fact, only yesterday somebody was saying to me, do you think they work against Chiletiella or in a rodent or a lagomorph species, and there's that kind of thing. Then the other area that we are there's three. So isoxazolines. Clinicians in general practice across the world, I suspect, spend an inordinate amount of time dealing with ear disease. So it's an area that's very poorly described. There's a variety of reasons for that, but I think that that's something for us to consider. Otitis and ear disease, mainly in dogs, but other species might work. And then the third area that's of major issue to all veterinarians is the use of antimicrobial products, and in that regard we're looking at microbiome and microbial pathogens, how we diagnose them, how we type them, how we deal with them. So straight off the top of my head, those are some of the areas that we're going to look at. The microbiome stuff is very complex and quite expensive to do, so not many people will be doing that. But the isoxazolines, people are using those quite widely, so good clinical trials on that is important. Otitis desperately needs good quality evidence, because the evidence base for our interventions for that is very, very, very poor. It's still largely led by key opinion leaders who are very experienced practitioners who are very good at what they do, but it doesn't always lend itself, sadly, to quality evidence that we can share widely. So those will be some initial thoughts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aiden. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on just these next couple of slides. I'm going to whiz through, so don't worry, you'll all be off very, very shortly. And then we'll end the webinar, and I will remind you where you can find the recording at the end of this. So on your screen right now, you'll see the Wiley Researcher Academy. So if you've enjoyed what you've seen today and you'd like some more, and I know that some of you mentioned that you'd like a bit more guidance, as well as author services, which I'm going to cover in just a tick. You'll also get a lot of great information from Wiley Researcher Academy. You can find comprehensive coverage of all the major challenges facing when publishing your scientific articles. We've created a comprehensive 50-hour training course that covers all aspects of the publishing process, as well as a detailed look at the skills and attributes of successful researchers. So you can find this, as it shows here, on wileyresearcheracademy.com. You'll also find that link under the Resources tab, and you can also find out how to recommend access for your research group. I talked about, and so has Aiden, about author services. This is an area where you can track the production status of your accepted article with Wiley. Also, you can sign license agreements. You can nominate up to 10 colleagues to gain free access to your published article from most journals. You can even provide your co-authors' email addresses so that they can track their article and receive free subscription access as well. You get free subscription access to your article through author services, but it is a hub full of some fantastic information, which is on peer review or on how to publish your article, how to even increase the impact of your articles. A lot of really good stuff in there. And then finally, we talked about wileyauthors.com/webinars. This is where you'll find a recording of the session. Once we've done this, I will then add it to that page. So you'll find it on there, as well as there are lots of other really good publishing hints and tips on there. This one specifically is going to be under the header Partners. So thank you so much, Aiden, for taking the time to talk to us today. And thank you to everybody that's attended. We hope you've enjoyed it. We've loved your feedback. Do add any other feedback into the comments, good or bad. We're here to listen to your feedback and make these webinars even better for next time. So thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to speaking to you soon.